My name was Jonathan Hayes. I was 74 when, on Christmas Day, my son closed the door in my face and said there were too many guests. I was left standing on the porch in just a blazer, with empty hands. The snow kept falling, as if someone up above wanted to erase everything to hell. An hour later, the police arrived. They stepped out of the car and handed my son a box. He opened it and dropped to his knees. Because it wasn't a gift inside. It was me. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Jonathan Hayes. I was 74 years old, and I lived alone in a 2-bedroom ranch house on the edge of Charlottesville, Virginia. I had worked most of my life as an electrician, 39 years in the city's utilities department, 12 more doing residential repairs after retirement until my knees gave out for good. That house had seen everything: births, holidays, quiet dinners, shouting matches, surgeries, grief. But lately, it had seen very little movement, just me, and the chair by the window. That chair had become my station. It wasn't particularly special, just an old recliner with cracked vinyl arms and a thin quilt Margaret had sewn years ago draped across the back. But it sat near the large front window, where the afternoon light came in through faded lace curtains and spread across the hardwood floor, like spilled cream. I spent most of my days there now, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because that was the only place left where time felt both visible and manageable. I could watch the mail truck, the neighborhood dogs, the wind moving through the pine branches across the street. Time didn't sneak past me there. It marched, slow and visible. Margaret had passed 5 years earlier, and the house had never filled back in after her. She used to leave traces of herself everywhere. Half-read books on the coffee table, the scent of lemon balm and fabric softener drifting from the laundry room, her quiet humming echoing off the tile as she washed dishes. After she was gone, I stopped replacing the hand towels when they frayed. I stopped lighting the vanilla candles she used to keep in the hallway. I left her side of the bed untouched, but I couldn't bring myself to change the chair by the window. I kept a small table beside it, just big enough for a coaster, a pair of glasses, and a brown ceramic mug with a faint chip on the rim. That mug was the only one I used. It had a faded American flag on the side, and the words, "Electrical Workers Union Local 422, printed underneath. The glaze was cracked near the handle. I liked the way it felt in my hand, like something that had already survived a few drops. Each morning, I boiled water for tea, never coffee. Margaret had weaned me off coffee in my 60s after the doctor told me my blood pressure had started climbing. She used to make a big show of measuring out the loose leaves into the little metal infuser, but now I just dropped a bag into the mug and poured. I sat with both hands wrapped around it and stared out at the street. The neighbors had changed. The Clarksons, who used to bring us sweet potato pie in December, moved to Florida. Their house now belonged to a young couple with a newborn and an aggressively friendly golden retriever. The dog barked at squirrels and passing cars, but never at me. Sometimes it would stop at the bottom of my driveway and look up toward the house like it expected someone to wave. Mornings were always the hardest. The sun would creep slowly across the wall and pool on the floor, illuminating every speck of dust, every scratch in the floorboards, every moment that had passed without notice. I kept the television off, the radio too. Noise felt like disrespect in a place that had grown quiet out of reverence. The only sounds came from the creaks in the baseboards, the occasional rattle of a vent, the sighing hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. I hadn't gotten around to fixing the hallway light switch. It flickered when turned on, a simple case of a loose wire behind the faceplate. But I never made the time. Me, a man who had rewired entire buildings, now living under a blinking hallway light. There was some kind of poetry in that, I supposed, or maybe just fatigue. The chair had a view not just of the front yard, but also of the street beyond it. I could see the bus stop where the neighborhood kids used to wait with their backpacks and bedhead. Now, only 2 of them still rode the school bus, the rest having grown into cars and after-school jobs. I watched them all go by. They never looked toward the window. I didn't blame them. I remembered what it was like to be 17 and believe the world was somewhere else. Margaret used to say I should get out more. Even in the years after her diagnosis, when her strength waned and her hands trembled, she urged me to take walks, to join the retired men's breakfast club at the diner down the street. I went a few times. The coffee was lukewarm, and the men talked about their prostates and real estate taxes. I never went back. My son Mark called once a week, always on Sundays, always in the early evening. He asked the same questions. "How are you feeling, Dad? Are you eating enough? Need anything from the pharmacy?" I answered politely. Sometimes I even added a joke. He always sounded distracted, like he was reading my voice between appointments. I knew he meant well, but I also knew that I had become a task, something on a list, not a person, not really, just a checkbox. He lived 20 minutes away, 40 in traffic. I hadn't seen him in 2 months. He used to bring the kids by once a month, sometimes more. But lately there had been soccer games, dance recitals, colds going around. Life. I understood. I truly did. But understanding didn't soften the ache. I kept a photo of Margaret and me on the window ledge. It was taken in 1986 at a 4th of July barbecue, back when I still had all my hair, and she still wore that wide-brimmed straw hat with the navy ribbon. We were both laughing at something just outside the frame. That photo hadn't faded a bit, maybe because I cleaned the glass once a week, careful not to disturb the frame. On the side table, I also kept a small black notebook. Inside, I wrote down little things, lists, fragments of thoughts, sometimes dreams, sometimes the names of tools I used to own. I didn't know why I kept it. Maybe I was afraid of forgetting, or maybe I just needed to see proof that I still existed. That morning, like every other, I sat in my chair, watching the street. The wind rattled the branches of the birch tree in the front yard. A bird landed briefly on the mailbox, then flew off again. The heater clicked on with a low groan. My tea had grown lukewarm, but I kept holding it, as if heat might return just from memory. The house no longer surprised me. Everything inside it had become an artifact. Every dent in the wall, every scuff on the doorframe where the kids had bumped into it during a game of chase. But even in stillness, the house whispered to me. Not in voices, but in reminders, in shadows that moved slightly, in the way the light found the corner of the carpet we never replaced, in the smell of lemon oil rising from the bookshelf. I did not speak. There was no one to speak to, but I sat, in the chair, by the window, and I waited. For what, I wasn't sure, but I waited all the same. The first snow came on December 12th. Light at first, just a powdered glaze across the grass, then heavier as the day wore on. I watched it from my usual spot in the chair, the steam from my tea rising as slowly as the gray sky darkened. The news had mentioned a storm moving across the state line, but I didn't pay attention to forecasts anymore. The seasons came whether you liked them or not. The Christmas tree in Mark's house went up early every year, right after Thanksgiving. He sent me a photo of it this time, one of those vertical snapshots from his phone. It was a tall tree, perfectly shaped, adorned with white lights and silver ribbon. No colored bulbs, no popcorn strings. It looked like something out of a magazine. My granddaughter was posing in front of it, wearing a red dress and tights, her arms lifted as if she'd helped decorate. Maybe she had. But I didn't see a single handmade ornament on the branches. No lopsided gingerbread men, no paper snowflakes curling at the edges, no evidence of the messiness that once made Christmas real. I remembered when Margaret and I used to let the kids decorate our tree. We never corrected them. If all the ornaments ended up on one side, we left them that way. There was joy in the imperfection. One year, Mark insisted on putting a plastic dinosaur near the top. Margaret had laughed and said, "Well, he's your angel this year, I guess." She kept that dinosaur in a box of ornaments for decades. I still had it. I held it in my hand the night before, tracing the chipped green tail with my thumb. I'd planned to bring it to Mark's house this year, not as a decoration, but as a memory. The gift I prepared for my grandson had taken me 2 weeks. I carved it from a block of aged walnut I'd stored in the garage for years. A toy car, smooth to the touch, with 4 sturdy wheels and a little driver's seat where a marble could sit. I didn't have a lathe anymore, so I shaped it by hand, sanding it slowly while the radio played Bing Crosby and old football games in the background. My hands weren't as strong as they used to be. My knuckles swelled if I worked too long. But each edge of that little car was sanded with care, with quiet purpose. I wrapped the gift in brown paper and tied it with twine. Margaret would have chosen bright paper with snowflakes or cardinals. I preferred simple wrapping, the kind that told you someone had touched it. I didn't include a tag. He'd know it was from me. I kept the gift on the coffee table all week. I'd look at it in the mornings, sometimes rotate it so the bow faced the window. I wanted the light to hit it just right. I imagined his face when he opened it. Not surprise. He was too old for that now. But maybe a flicker of something softer. A connection. Mark had invited me to their Christmas Eve dinner. Not with enthusiasm, but with obligation. He called 3 days before and said they were doing a thing at the house, and I could come by if I felt up to it. He used that phrase a lot now. If you feel up to it. As if my age had made every step optional. I told him I'd be there. He said great, and hung up before I could ask what time. On the 24th, I dressed carefully. I ironed my shirt, one of the last good ones, and dug out my navy cardigan. The one Margaret always said made me look presentable, but not stiff. I shaved slowly, nicking my chin once, and dabbed it with a piece of toilet paper until the bleeding stopped. The bathroom still smelled like her powder, a scent that hadn't faded from the tiles. The toy car went into a small paper bag, cushioned by tissue I'd taken from an old shoebox. I tucked the bag under my arm, grabbed my coat, and stepped outside into the crisp air. Snow had started again, a lazy drift of flakes swirling in the wind. My breath clouded in front of me as I made my way down the steps to the car. The drive to Mark's house took 21 minutes. I counted them without trying. The streets were slick but not icy, and the town was dressed in lights. Some houses went all out. Santa inflatables, twinkling reindeer, flashing borders along the gutters. Others kept it simple. A candle in each window, a wreath on the door. I always liked the candles. They reminded me of something quieter. When I pulled up to Mark's house, I parked along the curb behind 3 other cars. Family was already there. Through the frost-rimmed window, I could see the tree glowing in the corner of the living room. There were people moving inside, shadows of coats being taken off, wine glasses lifted. Laughter bubbled faintly, even through the glass. I stood at the bottom step for a moment before climbing the porch. The snow had dusted the wooden boards. I knocked once, then again. The door opened a few inches, and it was my daughter-in-law who greeted me. She looked surprised, maybe even annoyed. Her makeup was perfect, her smile brittle. She stepped outside, pulling the door mostly shut behind her. I could hear music behind her, Bublé or Sinatra. She said Mark was still getting things ready, and asked if I'd mind waiting just a little. She gestured toward the porch like it was a lounge. Before I could answer, she'd already gone back inside, pulling the door gently closed. I heard the latch click, so I stood there, on the porch, with the snow falling and the gift in my hands. The cold wasn't so bad at first. My coat was warm, and I shifted from foot to foot, thinking they'd come back soon. I looked at the wreath hanging on their door. White pine, red bow, little gold bells tucked into the branches. One of them jingled when she closed the door. A clean, high sound. Minutes passed. 10, then 15. I sat down on the top step and placed the bag beside me. The wooden boards were cold beneath me, and I could feel the damp creeping through my trousers. I rubbed my hands together, breathed into them. My knuckles looked like someone else's, red stiff, mapped with veins. Through the frosted window, I could still see the tree. People were gathered around it now. Mark held a wine glass. The kids were on the floor. Someone handed out gifts. A paper crown was placed on someone's head. There was laughter again. No one looked outside. I picked up the gift and placed it carefully on the doormat. Not out of anger, just because. It no longer felt right to hold it. It belonged inside. With them. Even if I didn't. I stood, brushed the snow off my coat, and stepped back down the stairs. I didn't ring the bell again. I walked to the curb. Not away. Just further from the warmth. I stood there under the streetlight as the snow continued to fall, as the windows stayed golden, as the toy car sat untouched on the mat beneath the wreath. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just stood. The snow settling on my shoulders, like dust on a photo no one had looked at in years. And still, I waited. The snow had grown crusty by the time the front door shut behind me. It wasn't fresh, not the kind that danced like sugar in the air. It was the kind that had already been walked on, hardened by wind and neglect, like it had been left behind just as I had. I stood there for a moment in my gray wool coat, which used to belong to my brother Frank. The collar itched at my neck, and one of the buttons hung by a thread. I had meant to fix it last winter, but the winter passed, and I forgot. Or maybe I chose not to remember. I didn't take my usual cane with me. I had left it leaning against the armchair, where the light hit in the mornings, and where dust liked to collect. My hands had remembered it too late. I reached for it once outside, like my body expected it to be there, but my palm caught nothing but the cold ache of air. My knees, stiff from decades of standing at workbenches, protested with every step. The concrete porch outside my son's house was slick and uneven. One of the tiles had cracked during the last big freeze. I had mentioned it once, months ago, during a barbecue. He said he'd fix it. He didn't. My foot found that very crack, and for a second my balance swayed dangerously. I righted myself with the grace of an old man used to falling, but not wanting to. My fingers clutched the railing, thin metal, painted black, peeling at the base. The paint flaked off into my hand like dry skin. I took the steps down, slowly, one at a time, like descending from some invisible grace. There had been laughter behind the door a moment ago. Not cruel, just distant. My grandson's voice, sharp and high, cut through the warmth I had left behind. The scent of pine and cinnamon had clung to me like a memory I couldn't hold on to. But out here, it disappeared. The air smelled of iron and old snow, with a trace of distant exhaust. There was no bench, no chair, just a narrow strip of concrete that curved toward the driveway, where two cars sat with their hoods coated in thin frost. I walked toward the edge of the garage wall, tucked into the corner where wind didn't quite reach. I thought maybe they'd come for me soon. Maybe they'd realized I'd forgotten my scarf, or that I'd left without shoes. But I had my shoes. Brown leather, scuffed at the toes, laces mismatched. One eyelet had torn. I'd repaired it with fishing wire, the only kind of thread I trusted. I leaned against the cold siding of the house. My breath made short-lived clouds that vanished before they could be counted. I watched a squirrel dart across the lawn, its tail high like a flag of defiance. There was a bird feeder nearby, one of those fancy ones shaped like a lighthouse. I had bought it for them last Christmas. I saw it now, still full, still untouched. The light inside the kitchen window glowed amber. Someone passed by. It could have been my daughter-in-law, but they didn't look out. Time started to pass differently out there. The cold has a way of bending minutes into longer shapes. I tried to keep warm by tightening my coat, but the lining had thinned over the years. I shoved my hands into my pockets, fingers curling around the familiar shape of a folded tissue and a key ring with only one key left. That key opened the shed back home, the place where my tools sat in quiet retirement. The smell of sawdust and oil returned to me suddenly, as vivid as the morning I taught my son how to sand a piece of pine. I counted the cars that passed. 5, then 7, then too many to recall. Each one felt like it could slow, roll down a window, ask what I was doing out here. But none did. I wasn't the sort of figure that invited questions. I had become part of the landscape, an elderly man in a gray coat leaning against a house on a winter day. My joints began to ache, not just the knees. My shoulders, my back, even the bones in my face began to feel the pressure of stillness. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, but it didn't help. My watch, an old Timex with a worn leather band, had stopped ticking 2 years ago. I still wore it. The glass face had cracked in a fall I never told anyone about. It was stuck at 11:06. I stared at that frozen time often, as if the world might eventually return to it. A neighbor came out to toss trash into a bin across the street. He didn't wave. He didn't glance. His boots crunched the snow, and his garage door yawned open like a metal sigh. He disappeared into it, and the sound echoed off the houses like a hollow drumbeat. I remembered a Christmas years ago when we had no money, but my wife had painted pine cones with glue and glitter. We hung them on a tree we found near the edge of the woods. My son, then just a boy, had clapped and said it was the most beautiful tree in the world. I wondered if he remembered that, if he remembered the mittens we shared that year, or the way she sang while boiling potatoes. My left leg had begun to tremble from the cold. The warmth inside my bones was leaking out, slowly, like coffee cooling in a forgotten cup. I shifted again, but the cold had made the concrete feel harder than usual, like it had risen up against me. My breath came slower now. My lips felt dry. I could taste metal in my mouth, like the taste after biting one's tongue. There was a thin layer of frost forming on my sleeves. I brushed it off. My fingers stung. I began to count backwards from 100, a habit I picked up in physical therapy, meant to distract from pain. I never reached 50. My thoughts kept slipping, unraveling like old yarn from a sweater my wife once knitted for me. That sweater had holes now, but I kept it folded in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. I opened it sometimes just to breathe it in. The world had grown quieter. No music, no voices, just the wind rustling somewhere above, tangled in gutters or bending a bare tree branch. I thought I heard the click of a camera once, or maybe it was the latch of a mailbox. Hard to tell. My hearing wasn't what it used to be. Eventually, I slid down to sit on the edge of the concrete. The cold bit through my trousers, and I winced, but I stayed. There was something final about sitting. It felt like permission to stop hoping, at least for a while. I looked up at the sky. Gray. No birds. The cloud cover was thick, like unspoken words. My fingers found the edge of my wedding ring, still on my hand. I turned it slowly, once, then again. The metal was warm against my skin, as if refusing to let go. And then I saw the police car. It turned the corner slowly, lights off, tires crunching the snow in a rhythm I would remember for a long time. It stopped a few feet from the driveway. The passenger door opened. A figure stepped out, holding something. A cardboard box. Brown. Ordinary. I couldn't yet see what was inside, but I knew. I knew by the way the officer looked at me, not with urgency, but with a kind of pity reserved for those who had been waiting too long in the wrong season. I didn't recognize the box at first. It was unmarked, save for a thin white ribbon that wrapped around it, loose and slightly crooked, like it had been tied in haste. The cardboard was soaked at the edges, where the snow had already begun to melt into it, darkening the brown into a muddy gray. The officer set it gently on the driveway near where I sat, not close enough to reach, but near enough that I could feel its presence like a breath on the back of my neck. I didn't move toward it. My legs had stopped shivering, which wasn't a good sign. Cold had its own way of fooling the body, taking away pain only to replace it with stillness. The ache in my knees was gone, and with it, the last bit of tension that kept me upright. I remained seated against the wall, eyes fixed on the box as though it might move or unfold itself like a story long buried. Somewhere above, the wind sighed through the dead branches of the maple tree. Its skeleton cast thin shadows across the driveway, webbing over the snow like veins. I could smell something faint in the air, pine sap, or maybe a neighbor's chimney, the burn of old oak logs. It stirred a memory I couldn't place, something distant, like the feeling of wrapping paper beneath my fingers when I was a boy. The officer said something. I couldn't hear him. The world had gone muffled, as if I were underwater. My own breath was the only sound that reached me, slow and uneven, dragging in the dry, icy air. My fingers had turned red, then pale, then something in between. I didn't try to warm them. I just let them rest in my lap, palms open, as if waiting for something to be returned. My wedding ring had shifted. It always did when my hands got cold, becoming looser, like it too wanted to escape the silence. I twisted it absent-mindedly, the way I used to do when my wife and I sat through Sunday service, and she would whisper to me with her eyes that she already knew the sermon. That ring had been resized twice, once after our first child was born, once again after I lost weight during her first round of chemo. The gold had dulled, but never lost its warmth. I tried to think what could be inside the box. My name wasn't on it, but something in the way the officer handled it made me certain it was for me, not officially, not wrapped with ceremony or sentiment, but chosen nonetheless, and left in a moment when I had been forgotten. There was a flash of movement, my grandson's face behind the window. He had pressed his hand to the glass. His breath fogged the pane in a soft oval, and then he was gone again, swallowed by the yellow light of the living room. The curtain shifted, not enough to be noticed by anyone inside. But I saw it. I noticed everything, now that I had nothing left to do but see. I finally leaned forward. My knees cracked like brittle branches under my weight, but I managed to rise into a crouch. The world spun slightly, not from weakness, but from something deeper, a misalignment between memory and reality. I reached for the box. The cardboard was soft beneath my fingers, soaked through at the base. I lifted it gently, holding it like one might hold a wounded bird. The weight surprised me. It wasn't heavy, but it had gravity, a kind of importance that didn't come from size. I walked it slowly back toward the wall, where the house's heat seeped faintly through the bricks. I sat again, the box in my lap, steam rising in small curls from the melted snow clinging to its sides. I didn't open it right away. I looked at it for a long time, reading nothing and everything into the creases of the cardboard. It reminded me of the boxes we used to keep in the attic, boxes filled with children's art projects, old birthday cards, and school photo prints in dusty envelopes. My wife had labeled them with years written in faded Sharpie. Her handwriting had always leaned slightly to the right, like it was eager to finish what it started. I pulled the ribbon loose. It came off without resistance, trailing down into my lap like a snake made of thread. I folded it gently, without knowing why. I just couldn't let it fall into the wet snow. The flaps of the box opened with a soft, reluctant creak. Inside, there was a small square object wrapped in newspaper. The print was from that morning. I recognized the headline, something about a fire at a downtown diner. I had eaten there once. The coffee was bad, but the waitress called me sweetheart. I peeled the paper back. Inside was a wooden picture frame, wrapped in bubble wrap. I could see the outline of what was beneath, something familiar and yet distant, like hearing your name whispered in a crowd. I removed the plastic slowly, letting the cold air touch the glass. It was a photo of me. Not recent, not formal. I remembered the day clearly now. My wife had taken it at the lake years ago. I was sitting on a bench, holding a sandwich in one hand and pointing at something in the water. Behind me, the sun had set, everything gold. I looked tired, but content. My wife always said that was the only photo of me where I didn't look like I was hiding. Beneath the photo, tucked between the frame and the backing, was a single sheet of paper, handwritten, not printed. The ink was smudged slightly at the edges. The handwriting was blocky, uneven. My grandson's. It simply said, "I wanted you to be here." No name, no explanation, just that. I held the photo close. My hands, trembling now not from cold, but from something else, touched the edge of the glass as if trying to reach through it. I thought about the things we carry without knowing, the boxes we leave behind, and the ones we never expect to receive. I looked up at the house, where the light now seemed softer. The laughter had faded. Or maybe I had just stopped listening. Snow had begun again, light flakes drifting down, catching on my eyelashes and the collar of my coat. I didn't brush them away. I let them fall, covering the ground, the ribbon, the empty wrapping paper beside me. That small gift sat in my lap, like a second heartbeat. And for the first time that Christmas, I felt something warm, even if it came too late. The journal had a cracked leather cover, the kind that darkened over time and softened around the edges, like old hands that had held too many winters. I had bought it in a bookstore in Vermont the year my wife died, back when silence had become too loud to bear. The pages were cream-colored, thick, and faintly lined, with tiny flecks of pulp embedded in the paper like fossilized snowflakes. I hadn't written in it much over the years, only in moments that refused to pass quietly. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table, the same table we had bought together in 1973. Its legs had been re-glued twice, and one corner bore the burn mark from where a birthday candle had toppled over during my son's 8th birthday. The varnish had worn away in patches, exposing the raw oak beneath. I ran my hand over it, feeling the indentations left by time, fingernails, forks, and forgotten moments. Outside, the sky was white and expressionless, like a sheet pulled too tightly over the earth. The snow hadn't stopped. It just kept coming, not in flurries, but in a slow, determined drift, as if the world was trying to erase itself inch by inch. The radiators hissed occasionally, their old pipes clanking in protest against the cold that seeped through the poorly insulated windows. I had set the thermostat to 68, not out of thrift, but out of habit. My wife always said warmth should be earned. I opened the journal to a blank page. The spine cracked like an old knee. I hadn't touched it in over a year. The last entry was from the previous Christmas, a brief paragraph about a pie that had collapsed in the oven, and a memory of her humming while washing dishes. The ink had faded slightly, as if the memory itself had started to retreat. I picked up my pen. Not one of those modern gel things, but an old black roller ball with a brass clip and a habit of drying out if I didn't write regularly. I uncapped it, gave it a shake, and wrote the date in the top corner. December 25th. The numbers looked stiff, like soldiers standing in the snow. I stared at them for a long time. Then I began. I was outside for an hour. Just that. 5 words. But it cracked something open. I continued writing, letting the thoughts spill out without editing, without control. I described the way the wind had crawled through my coat seams and into the small of my back. I wrote about the hard bench, the crunch of snow beneath my boots, the quiet humiliation of being forgotten. I wrote about the gift box, the photo, and the simple note that had both broken me and glued something back together. My handwriting had changed. It wavered more now. The strokes leaned awkwardly left, as though resisting the weight of the words. I didn't care. I wrote about how I had looked up at the house and felt like a ghost, a blurry outline pressed against the margins of a holiday no one invited me into. I wrote about the smell of pine and chimney smoke, and how both made me think of things I couldn't bring back. A small space heater near my feet whirred with a low hum. I could smell the metal heating coil inside, that faint toasted dust scent that reminded me of old motel rooms and high school gymnasiums. I pulled the shawl tighter around my shoulders. My wife used to knit while watching television. This was the last one she had finished. Deep forest green with flecks of burgundy, the kind of color you only notice when light hits it just right. I paused to rest my hand. It cramped more easily these days. The veins on the back of it stood up like tributaries. My wedding ring had left a permanent dent in my finger, even though I hadn't taken it off since the day she passed. I let the pen roll to the edge of the table and tapped my fingers gently against the journal page, as if trying to feel the pulse of what I had written. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I turned to the first page. The very first. It had a name scrawled across the top in bold letters. Charles D. Holloway. My name. Underneath it, in her handwriting, so different from mine, round and looping, she had written one sentence. Write what you can't say. She had done that the day she gave me the journal. It was a Sunday. She placed it in my lap after church, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. I had smiled, nodded, said thank you. But I never told her that I didn't know how to begin. Now, decades later, I understood. I flipped back to the current page and added to the bottom of the entry. I was outside for an hour, but I've been outside much longer than that. I think I'm ready to come back in. I closed the journal, its leather cover warm from the touch of my palms. I set it beside the old mug of tea I hadn't finished, its liquid cold now, a film forming at the top. The smell was faint, chamomile and something bitter, maybe the remnants of honey from an old spoon. A knock at the window startled me. It was a bird, not a person. A small red cardinal, vibrant against the gray. It perched on the ledge for a second, then flew off. But in that moment, it felt like a message. Not from anyone in particular, just from the day itself, reminding me that I still existed inside it. I reached for the shawl again and stood slowly. My knees cracked. I carried the journal with me to the shelf by the front door, where I kept the mail and a bowl of spare keys. I placed it gently there, on top of an unopened water bill and a coupon booklet from the grocery store. Then I walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. Snow covered the porch, smooth and undisturbed, like a blank page waiting. I stayed there for a while, watching it fall, watching everything soften under its weight, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like the story wasn't over. Just paused, and that was enough. The officer set the box down like it weighed more than it did. Cardboard, plain brown, slightly damp on one corner from the snow. No markings except for a thin strip of red tape across the top. An unusual touch that made it feel less like packaging and more like something sacred. He didn't look me in the eye when he placed it at my feet. He just nodded, and the snow on his shoulders melted into the collar of his uniform as he stepped away. I stared at it for a long time before reaching out. My fingers were stiff, not from the cold alone, but from something deeper, a kind of hesitation that I hadn't felt in years. I remembered the weight of Christmas gifts from long ago, back when my wife would wrap them in gold foil and hide them beneath the tree with tiny notes taped underneath. To Dad, do not shake. This box felt heavier than all of those combined, even though I hadn't yet lifted it. I ran my hand over the lid. The cardboard was rough, textured with the imprint of storage and time. The corners were soft, slightly bent, as if it had been carried too far for too long. The tape wasn't glossy. It was matte, industrial, the kind you find in post offices or morgues. That realization hit me like a fist in the chest. I didn't want to open it anymore, but I did. The sound of the tape tearing echoed louder than I expected. It reminded me of the ripping paper I used to hear on Christmas mornings when my son was little, his small hands too eager to be delicate. I peeled it back slowly, the red strip coming apart in fragments, and finally opened the flaps. There was no ceremony to it, but it felt like unsealing a tomb. The first thing I saw was cloth, not folded, not neatly arranged, just a crumpled navy blue wool scarf that looked too familiar. I picked it up, and the smell of cedar hit me immediately. Not fresh cedar, but the dry, tired scent of a closet that hadn't been opened in years. My wife's closet. I had stored her things there after she passed, wrapping each item in tissue and lavender sachets. This scarf had been hers once, then mine. I had given it to my son 2 winters ago when he said he'd lost his. And now, it was here. Beneath it was a small leather-bound book. The cover had a crack along the spine, and the edges of the pages were tinged with gold leaf. I knew it before I touched it. It was my journal, the one I thought I'd lost, the one I had stopped writing in after my wife's funeral, the one that held my thoughts in cramped handwriting, my questions for God, my guilt, my dreams, my regrets. I had hidden it, ashamed of what I wrote inside, and now it stared up at me, like a mirror. I flipped through the pages. Some had smudged ink from where my hand had rested too long. Others had small stains. Coffee tears, I couldn't remember which. I saw a pressed leaf fall out from between 2 entries, brittle and orange. I had picked it up on our last walk through the neighborhood before she got sick. I had forgotten I'd placed it there. My hand trembled as I tucked it back between the pages. And under the journal, wrapped in a soft cotton cloth, was the frame. I knew it instantly by its weight. Brass corners, cold to the touch, and slightly tarnished. I unwrapped it carefully. It was our wedding photo, the original, the one that used to sit by my bedside before my son had packed it away, saying it was too much for the kids to see first thing in the morning. He said it was too sad. But it wasn't sad. It was sacred. Her eyes looked at me from the photo the way they always had, like I was enough, like the man I used to be was still there. I ran my thumb over the glass, over her smile, and for a moment I felt like I could breathe again. At the very bottom of the box was a folded sheet of paper. I almost missed it. It was tucked beneath the cardboard lining, creased and faded. I unfolded it carefully. It was a list, handwritten, in my son's handwriting. At first glance, it looked like a packing list: scarf, book, photo. But then I saw what followed each item: scarf. He gave this to me when I said I was cold. I didn't deserve it. Book. I read the last entry. He still prays for me. Photo. She would have hated what I've become. The box wasn't from the police. Not really. It was from my son. He had packed it himself, and he had sent it to the officers not as evidence, not as lost property, but as a message, a quiet one, an apology he couldn't say out loud, a gesture shaped in silence, wrapped in memory, and delivered not through words, but through the weight of these objects. I sat back against the stone wall behind me. The snow still fell, gentle now, almost forgiving. I laid the items beside me, one by one, like relics, like proof of a life that still echoed in someone's mind. the scarf over my knees, the journal in my lap, the photo in my chest pocket. And I waited. Not for him, not anymore, but for the part of me that had gone missing years ago. The part that still remembered how to feel warmth through more than just wool and brass, and pages filled with sorrow. And somewhere inside that moment, wrapped in snow, silence, and the things he'd returned, I felt the faintest glow of something that resembled peace. I sat near the kitchen window, the same one I used to clean every Sunday morning, back when it mattered if sunlight came through clean or not. The glass hadn't been touched in months, maybe years. Fingerprints, condensation marks, the streak of an old lemon-scented wipe long faded into smudge, all still there like ghosts, like the residue of people who once touched this house and then left it behind. I stared at those stains, as if they might tell me something about what remained of me. The chair I sat in creaked when I shifted my weight. It was the same chair from our old dining room set, mismatched now to the rest of the furniture in my son's house. He had replaced nearly everything with glossy pieces from catalogs, but he let me keep this chair because it didn't squeak too loud, as if silence had become a currency I needed to earn. I had polished the armrests down over the years, worn smooth by my palms. One small notch remained on the left side, where my grandson once bit the wood as a toddler, pretending he was a pirate. The glass pane in front of me had a diagonal hairline crack in the corner. I remembered when it appeared, 2 winters ago, during a sudden temperature drop. My daughter-in-law said we'd replace it, but no one did. It became invisible in the routine of their lives, but I noticed it every time I looked out. It ran like a frozen vein through the window, distorting the trees outside, slicing the reflection of the fence in two. Through the pane, I could see the backyard. Empty chairs dusted with snow, a fire pit filled with ice, the toy tractor abandoned near the shed. No child had played with it in years. A garden wind chime clinked faintly against its own metal frame, but there was no wind. On the windowsill sat a glass bowl that used to hold pine cones. My wife had arranged them every fall, her way of saying the season had turned. Now the bowl held nothing but dust and the brown petal of a forgotten artificial flower. I picked it up and rubbed it between my fingers. It felt like paper, dry and resistant, like something pretending to be soft but incapable of softness. I noticed a smudge on the glass that looked like a handprint, too small to be mine. Maybe it had been left by one of the children when they still came to visit. Or perhaps it was from last week, when I leaned close with my forehead resting against the cold surface, watching the snowfall without really seeing it. I couldn't remember. I leaned forward again, my breath forming a cloud against the pane. The fog blurred the outside world, hiding the skeletal trees and the dead garden. I wiped it away with my sleeve. In doing so, I noticed something new, small flecks on the inside of the glass, like specks of oil or fingerprints left by someone reaching from the other side. They hadn't been there before. I stood slowly, letting the familiar groan of my knees remind me that time had been moving forward without my consent. I stepped closer to the window, squinting at the stains. I pressed my thumb gently against one of them, and it shifted slightly, like it had only just dried. But no one else had been in this room since morning. The others were out shopping or visiting friends. I had been left here again, just as I always was. I looked down and saw, on the floor just beneath the window, a folded towel, my old cleaning rag, faded blue, with a corner frayed to the point of unraveling. I picked it up and stared at it. The scent of vinegar clung to it still, sour and sharp, like memory itself. I brought it up to the glass and rubbed at one of the stains. It came off slowly, but it left behind a cloudy ring, as if the window had absorbed something permanent. Outside, the light had shifted. The sun broke through the clouds briefly, scattering brightness across the snow. The reflection of the sun hit the glass just right, and for a moment I saw myself clearly. My own face, my eyes, my hollow cheeks. But just behind me, reflected faintly in the window, was the outline of someone else. I turned quickly. No one was there. The hallway behind me was empty. The living room was still. I waited for a sound, a creak, a cough, a child's step, but nothing came. Only the hush of the house settling, the dry tick of the old clock above the stove, and the distant hum of the refrigerator motor winding down into silence. I turned back to the glass. The outline was gone. Or perhaps it had never been there at all. I wiped the rest of the stains carefully, one by one. I didn't rush. I pressed with purpose, as if each spot held a secret, a trace of someone I used to be, or someone who used to care. My hands moved in small circles, the way my wife used to clean mirrors. She always said to work from the center outward, never the edges first. "Let the glass breathe from its heart," she once told me. I had laughed at the time, but now, moving in slow, deliberate spirals, I understood what she meant. By the time I finished, the sun had dipped behind the house, casting the window in shadow again. I stepped back and looked at the glass. It was cleaner, but not clear. The crack still ran like a scar across its corner, and the cloudy rings from the stains were still faintly visible beneath the new shine. It would never be perfect, but it was mine again. I returned to my chair and sat down slowly. I placed the rag on my lap and folded my hands over it. The silence returned like an old coat, familiar, heavy, oddly comforting. And I watched the world through imperfect glass, wondering whether what I saw was real or just the last echo of someone I used to be, reaching forward one last time. The attic was colder than I remembered. The insulation, if there had ever been any worth naming, had long since given up the fight against Ohio winters. The wooden stairs groaned beneath my weight as I ascended, one careful step at a time, holding on to the splintered railing with the same caution I once used for balancing books on the top shelf. Each creak sounded louder than the last, like the house was trying to warn me. The bulb above flickered twice before settling into a dull orange glow, just bright enough to give the shadows something to lean against. The pull cord swung lazily in the middle of the room, as if recently touched. I reached out and stopped it with 2 fingers, and the attic stilled. Boxes, stacks of them, some marked with black marker, others bare, their cardboard softening with the moisture of time. A few were split open at the corners, the contents threatening to spill out like memory bleeding through seams. I took a breath. The air smelled of paper, mildew, old glue, that particular scent of forgotten things. In the far corner sat a file cabinet I hadn't touched in decades, gray metal, scratched and slightly rusted around the edges, with a top drawer that never quite closed. My name, printed neatly on a faded label, Walter Granger. Beneath it, a second label, tax records, as if the sum of my life could be measured in itemized deductions and W-2s. I shuffled toward it, my slippers brushing against the attic floor, kicking up dust motes that spun in the orange light like ash. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached the drawer, not from age, but from expectation. I pulled it open, and the rails screeched in protest. Folders packed tightly together, arranged with the meticulous care I had once given every account I ever handled. Receipts from the 1980s, handwritten ledgers from the small business I'd run out of the garage, letters from clients now long dead. A photograph fell out and slid across the floor, a Polaroid curling at the edges, showing me and Martha in front of our first office. Her smile looked wider than I remembered. My tie was crooked. I bent down and picked it up, brushing the corner gently with my thumb. But I hadn't come here for nostalgia. I came for the other cabinet. Behind a wall of broken-down boxes and a folded ping-pong table, half swallowed by old curtains and a lamp with no shade, stood a second file cabinet, one with no label. I had nearly forgotten it was there. The key still hung from a yellowed ribbon tied to the top drawer. It looked like a necklace left behind by a ghost. I untied the ribbon and inserted the key. It turned with a hesitant click. The drawer opened to reveal rows of folders, each one labeled with a month and year in my own handwriting. Not professional files, not records of clients or audits. These were mine. Journals, notes, letters I never sent, pages of things I hadn't said, couldn't say. I had written them during the years after Martha's stroke, when silence had become the only safe way to speak. I pulled out the folder marked December 2011. Inside were 12 pages, dated, numbered, written in pen. No flourishes, just facts wrapped in feeling. One paragraph caught my eye, a description of the first Christmas we spent alone after the kids moved out, how I'd stayed up until midnight waiting for a phone call that never came. I remembered the bitter taste of cocoa that night, how I'd burned my tongue because I hadn't waited for it to cool. Below that entry was another, dated 2 days later, describing how I had wrapped a gift for my son and left it on the porch, only to find it still there 3 days later, soggy from the snow. I hadn't even mentioned it to him. I had told myself maybe he was busy, maybe the weather kept him away. I folded the page slowly, listening to the sound it made, the whisper of paper closing on itself. I read more. Accounts of everyday things that no one else would care about. The way the furnace had made a strange knocking sound. The smell of Martha's shampoo lingering on the pillow. A note about how the maple tree in the backyard had lost its last leaf on a Tuesday afternoon, and how it reminded me of the day she first forgot my name. Every folder was like this, a quiet archive of vanishing. No one knew it existed. I sat down on an old trunk beside the cabinet, the cold metal biting through my robe. I held the folder against my chest and closed my eyes. The attic was silent, except for the occasional drip from a pipe above, ticking rhythmically like a metronome. I remembered how Martha used to say that time didn't move in straight lines, that it looped and curled around us, collecting itself in dusty corners like this one. I opened another folder. March 2013. Inside was a note addressed to my son that I never mailed. I had written it after learning he'd been laid off and never told me. It wasn't angry, just confused. It asked a simple question. When did we stop telling each other the truth? The letter was 3 pages long. I read it again and felt the same tightness in my chest that I had the day I wrote it. The corners of the folders were soft, the paper yellowed slightly, the ink faded. But they had survived. Better than conversations, better than holidays, better than me. The attic light flickered again. I glanced up and saw a cobweb tremble in the draft from the cracked eaves. I stood and replaced the folders carefully, aligning them with the quiet reverence of someone laying bricks at their own grave. I closed the drawer, turned the key, and retied the ribbon with a small, deliberate knot. I stood for a while, not moving, letting the quiet settle again. Then I reached for the old Polaroid still sitting on the floor and tucked it into my pocket. When I descended the stairs, I left the light on. Let the dust float. Let the paper breathe. Let the archive wait. It knew I would return. The switch by the garage door hadn't worked in over 10 years. I still flipped it each time I entered, out of habit more than hope. That morning, the brittle click echoed in the dim concrete space like a reflex forgotten by the body, but preserved by muscle memory. The fluorescent bulb above buzzed once and went dark again. I didn't bother with it after that. The cold in the garage was different from the chill of the attic. It clung to the cement, soaked into the soles of my slippers, and pressed up through the thin cotton of my pajama bottoms, like a quiet reprimand. The air smelled of rust, motor oil, and something fainter, maybe old leather or the dried-out paper of forgotten manuals. I hadn't driven in years, but the car sat there like a sleeping animal, covered in a dusty gray sheet, its outline familiar and foreign at the same time. I moved slowly around it, my breath making clouds in the still air, trailing behind me like a memory I couldn't lose. On the workbench near the far wall, under a pile of old extension cords and stiff-coiled garden hose, sat a box of Martha's old canning jars. The kind with the metal clasps and rubber rings. She used to line them up on our kitchen counter, filled with jams I never liked, and pickles I secretly adored. Now they were empty, a few with the faint trace of red or green still dried on the inside. I picked one up, held it to the light. The glass felt cool, heavier than I remembered. I set it down with a soft thud. Next to the jars was an old battery charger, the analog kind with a needle and a hum that always made me think of lawnmowers and Saturday afternoons. I traced my finger across its surface, feeling the dust give way to skin. Behind it, something glinted. A ring of spare keys, one of them marked with a strip of blue tape. That one had belonged to the shed. The shed. I hadn't opened it in years. I think the last time was when I went looking for the snow shovels after Martha passed and couldn't bring myself to throw anything away. I took the key and shuffled outside, the air slicing across my cheeks like a reminder that winter hadn't finished with us yet. The path to the shed had half disappeared under snow drifts, but the outline was there, like the memory of an old trail. The padlock was stiff, reluctant. I had to blow warm breath on the metal twice before the key would even turn. When it finally gave, it made a sound like something exhaling after being forgotten too long. The door opened slowly, hinges groaning in protest, and inside, darkness, dust, familiar outlines. There were shelves along the left wall, all bowed in the center like spines under too much weight. On them, toolboxes, plastic bins, coffee cans filled with nails, bolts, screws. The things I used to sort on Sunday mornings when I needed silence. On the right wall hung the bikes we hadn't ridden since the Clinton administration. One tire was flat, the rubber cracked, sagging like an old balloon. I touched the handlebars of Martha's, remembering how she used to complain that the seat pinched no matter how she adjusted it. I left it hanging. Toward the back, beneath a drop cloth and an old Boy Scouts flag, was the generator. It was heavier than I remembered. I pulled the cloth away, releasing a smell of old gasoline and faint mildew. The red casing had dulled with age, but the switch was still clear. I had bought it after the storm in '94, when the power had gone out for 4 days, and Martha refused to let the freezer full of summer peaches go to waste. She boiled them all down by candlelight, her face glowing amber in the flicker. The jars sat for months unopened, more offering than food. I wheeled the generator slowly to the front of the shed. The wheels groaned, stiff with disuse, but moved, like old bones cracking back into place. I pulled it down the path and into the garage, inch by inch, the way I used to push strollers, the way I helped Martha walk in her last weeks, one foot, then the other. Nothing dramatic, just movement. Once inside, I reached for the gas can. It was still half full. I poured slowly, watching the liquid slosh like liquid amber inside the reservoir. The smell was sharp, metallic, unmistakable. My fingers ached from the cold, but I didn't stop. I checked the choke, tapped the primer twice. Then I pulled. The first time, nothing. The second time, a groan. The third, a cough. And on the fourth, it caught. The garage filled with that unmistakable hum, the low, steady heartbeat of something alive again. I stood there, watching it vibrate gently, the exhaust snaking up toward the vent I had forgotten I installed. The warmth hadn't reached me yet, but the sound had. It was the sound of control, of agency, of choice. I turned on the cord reel and walked it to the side of the house. The Christmas lights were still there, half buried under snow, but I found the main plug. It was an old green cord, slightly frayed at the end, but still working. I connected it. And slowly, as the hum deepened and steadied, the house began to glow. One string of lights at first, then another. The bushes blinked to life, the porch rail wrapped in soft golden loops. A deer made of wire lit up beside the stairs. The wreath on the door pulsed faintly, like it had remembered its purpose. I stood there, arms crossed, breath hanging in the air, watching it all come back. Inside, the furnace kicked on. The old energy had returned, not just to the house, but to me. I went back into the garage and closed the door behind me. The generator rumbled gently, like a tired dog happy to be of use again. I stood beside it, hand resting on the casing, the warmth beginning to seep into my fingers. The house wasn't empty. Not yet. Not while it still remembered how to shine. And neither was I. The envelope had been sitting on my nightstand for almost a week before I finally opened it. It wasn't fear that kept me from tearing it open, nor dread. It was something quieter, something more settled, like the way an old man hesitates before putting on a new pair of shoes, not because he doubts they'll fit, but because he still remembers the shape of the old ones. The paper was thick, smooth to the touch, and slightly cream-colored, not the usual bleached white that most mail arrived in these days. My name was printed in small block letters, not handwritten, not personal, just clear. I slit the top open with the same letter opener I'd used since 1973, the one Martha gave me when we moved into our first house. Brass handle, slightly loose now, still sharp. I had once tried to polish it back to its former shine, but gave up halfway. It looked better aged. Inside the envelope was a single sheet, one address, a post office box in a town 3 counties over. I looked at it for a long time before folding the page in half and sliding it into my wallet. Not to forget it, but to carry it. To weigh its presence against everything else I still kept tucked away. The next morning, I went down to the basement. The furnace rumbled to life behind me as I flicked the switch at the top of the stairs. The bare bulb hanging from the low ceiling buzzed and glowed like a sleepy eye. I moved slowly through the clutter, past the shelves of paint cans and half-empty bottles of wood glue, until I reached the old cedar chest in the corner. The hinges creaked as I opened it, and a puff of dry, sweet wood smell met my nose. It was the scent of childhood Christmases, of toy trains and orange slices, and Martha's cinnamon-sprinkled coffee cake. Inside, there were blankets folded decades ago, a stack of old comic books held together with rubber bands, and a wooden box. I took the box upstairs and set it on the dining room table. The house was quiet, still, the kind of silence that feels deliberate, like it's listening. The box had a sliding lid, and inside were slips of paper, all carefully folded. Notes, mostly. Records. Letters I'd never sent. The kind of things you write not because you think someone will read them, but because the writing itself makes the weight a little easier to carry. I sifted through them until I found the one I needed, a yellowed receipt with my name and social security number on it, signed and dated. It was enough. I sat at the kitchen counter and opened my laptop. The battery was nearly dead. I hadn't used it in months, but I plugged it in beside the coffee maker and waited for the blue light to blink awake. The screen took its time. The hum of the hard drive was faint, but it came back to life, slowly, like me. I logged into the DMV site, navigated through page after page of forgotten passwords and identity questions. Where was I born? What street did I live on in 1986? What was the name of my childhood pet? Walter, my first dog. I typed it in and smiled when the system accepted it without hesitation. Walter had been the only thing that followed me without question, without complaint. When we moved, when we aged, when the kids were born, he was there. The form took time. I filled it out carefully. Current address. I left that blank. Forwarding address. The post office box. Reason for update. Relocation. I paused before submitting. then clicked. There was no confirmation screen, just a green check mark and a line of text saying a new ID would be mailed in 7 to 10 business days. That was all. I closed the laptop and poured myself a cup of coffee. It had gone cold, but I didn't bother reheating it. The taste didn't matter. It was the act of drinking it, the weight of the ceramic in my hand, the feel of steam even when it was imagined. Later that day, I walked to the mailbox. The wind had picked up, and the sky had turned a pale gray, the kind that sat low and wide, like a heavy sheet. My mailbox was old, green with flecks of rust, and tilted slightly to one side. I opened it and placed a stamped envelope inside. No return address, no name, just the same post office box printed in the top left corner. Inside was a photograph. It showed me and Martha, 1978, standing on the porch of our second house. She wore her navy dress with the white collar, and I had on the brown corduroy jacket she hated, but never threw away. Our youngest had just been born. You could see her hand resting on the stroller handle. I had trimmed the photo to fit the envelope. On the back, in pencil, I had written 2 words, "For memory." I let the mailbox close slowly. The wind caught it, and it snapped shut harder than I expected. That night, I sat in my chair by the window, the same one I'd kept near the radiator since the first winter after Martha passed. The upholstery was worn, especially on the left armrest where I always leaned. I placed a small notebook on my lap. Its cover was soft, gray, worn at the corners. I opened it and turned to the last page I had written, and I added a new line. December 27th, officially changed my address today. No forwarding family, only air and silence. I closed the notebook and left it on the radiator, the heat warming its spine. Somewhere outside, the wind shook the pine tree in the front yard, the one I planted the year my first granddaughter was born. It had grown taller than the roof. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, listening to the branches tap against the window like a quiet knock, like someone asking if I was still here. The landline hadn't rung in months. It sat on the hallway table like a relic, its coiled cord stiff from disuse, dust gathered in the grooves of its plastic buttons. I kept it mostly out of habit. Everyone used cell phones now, everyone but me. I liked the way the receiver felt in my hand, its familiar weight, the soft click when you set it back into its cradle. That morning, I had been watering the Christmas cactus near the dining room window when the phone rang. It wasn't a sharp sound, but it broke the stillness like a dropped glass in an empty room. I froze for a second, hand still hovering near the pot, watching a droplet of water roll down a bent pink bloom and land soundlessly on the wood below. I dried my hands on the dish towel that always hung crooked on the oven handle and walked toward the hallway. The phone rang a second time. By the third, I had picked it up. There was a pause, the kind that tells you the person on the other end didn't expect you to answer. I heard a breath, not sharp but measured, and then a voice, male, low, my son's. He didn't say my name. He didn't say Dad. He just started speaking, as if the conversation had already begun without me, as if I were just now arriving to listen in. He mentioned the box. He said the police had dropped it off at their house 2 nights ago, said they didn't open it right away, said they thought it was junk or a prank or some forgotten Christmas delivery. But when they finally did, he said, the house changed. The silence afterward was different, not empty, but loaded. He paused. I heard something in the background, maybe the creak of a floorboard, maybe the edge of someone else breathing. He said he'd found something inside the box, something old, familiar. He used the word shocking, but it didn't carry heat. It sounded like someone trying to recall a dream after it had already faded. He mentioned a letter, not just one, but several. My handwriting, my signature, things I had written years ago and never sent. He said he didn't know how I'd managed it, said he thought I was done with all that, with reaching out, with remembering. I didn't speak. I just stood there, the phone cord twisted around my fingers, the air around me holding steady, like waiting for a storm that doesn't come. He said my name once, not loudly, not emotionally, just my name, like a question and a memory at the same time. Then he asked where I was, not angrily, not accusingly, just a quiet, wondering where. The kind of question a boy might ask when he loses sight of his father in a crowd and doesn't know if he should run forward or wait where he stands. I didn't answer. He said he'd driven by the old house last week, said he thought he saw someone sitting in the window, but the curtains were half drawn. Said he wasn't sure if it was me or just his own reflection. Said the pine tree had gotten too tall, needed trimming. He paused again. Then the line crackled faintly, and I heard him take a breath that sounded more like resignation than sorrow. He said, "Anyway." And then he hung up. I stood there long after the click, the hum of the empty line still in my ear. I placed the receiver gently back on its cradle and looked at my hands. They weren't shaking, not this time, just still. In the hallway mirror, I caught a glimpse of myself. My sweater hung loose around my shoulders. The floor creaked under my bare feet. I reached up to straighten the picture frame above the phone. It was a photo from 1985, our last Christmas all together. The corner had begun to curl under the glass. I walked to the kitchen and opened the drawer where I kept the envelopes, the kind with security patterns on the inside. I took one out, slipped a blank piece of paper inside, and sealed it. On the front, I wrote only an address, the same post office box, the same deliberate handwriting, steady, clear. I set the envelope by the door. Outside, the wind had changed direction. The air carried the scent of chimney smoke and cold bark. I wrapped myself in my wool coat and stepped onto the porch. The railing was slick with frost. My breath came out in long, even clouds. I walked down the steps, the snow crunching under my soles, and headed to the mailbox at the corner. The envelope in my pocket felt warm against my chest. When I reached the mailbox, I stood for a moment, looking down the street. Lights twinkled from a distant window. Somewhere, a dog barked once, then fell silent. I dropped the letter into the box and listened to the soft, final sound it made as it slid down. I didn't expect an answer. Not anymore. But I had sent something. And that was enough. That morning, I woke to the sound of wind scraping against the side of the house, like fingernails on old wood. The bedroom was dim, lit only by the thin blue light pressing through the frosted window pane. I stayed in bed longer than usual, wrapped in the thick wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and dust. My bones ached, not sharply, but in the slow, echoing way that made getting up feel like remembering something you wish you hadn't. There was no tree in the living room. I hadn't bothered. Not this year. In past years, even alone, I had always put something up. A small artificial pine I kept in the attic, its branches slightly bent from years of use. The same set of ornaments I'd wrapped in yellowing tissue paper and tucked away in a shoebox. I used to play a cassette tape of carols on the old player in the kitchen, letting the music float through the house like a ghost wearing bells. I'd light a cinnamon-scented candle and pour a small glass of eggnog, even if I didn't finish it. But not this year. I made coffee in silence. The pot took its time, groaning and spitting steam. The scent filled the kitchen slowly, mingling with the cold air that seeped in through the cracks near the floor. I held the warm mug in both hands and watched the snow through the back window. It fell in tight, silent spirals. Everything was covered now. The shed, the bare branches of the dogwood tree, the faded lawn chairs I had never stored away. All white. All still. I sat at the kitchen table with a piece of dry toast, and the radio turned low. The voice of a news anchor spoke of travel delays, holiday messages from the president, a story about reindeer spotted near a school in Minnesota. I didn't laugh. I didn't even smile. I chewed slowly, methodically, as if trying to remember what food was supposed to taste like. The house smelled faintly of old books and wood polish. I kept the thermostat low to save money, so I wore 2 sweaters and thick socks that reached nearly to my knees. Every few minutes, I adjusted the collar of my shirt, a habit from when I used to wear ties to work, even though I hadn't needed to in years. The mantel was bare, no stockings, no garland, just the clock, a dark walnut thing with brass hands, its tick hollow and echoing. It was the same clock that had once stood in my parents' house, and later in mine. It had survived 2 moves, 1 flood, and a curious grandchild who once pried off the back and left a dime inside. It ticked on, indifferent. I opened the bottom drawer of the sideboard and pulled out a box. Inside were the cards I'd received in previous years. I leafed through them slowly, touching each one like it might dissolve. Most were signed with just names. Some had faded ink. Others still held the scent of perfume or glue or a foreign place. I placed them on the table, one by one, like laying out evidence of something long past. There was no knock at the door, no delivery, no voice calling out. The phone didn't ring. Even the neighbor's dog, which usually barked at squirrels and shadows, was silent. It was as if the world had folded inward for the day, wrapping itself in silence and leaving me outside it. By noon, the sky had turned from silver to the color of paper ash. I put on my coat, the heavy one with the torn pocket, and stepped onto the porch. The wind caught the edge of the screen door and pulled it slightly before I let it close behind me. My breath came out in thick clouds. I stood there, staring at the empty street, the cars parked like abandoned thoughts. I didn't go anywhere. I just stood. The snow had no scent. Only the cold registered, sharp at first, then dull. A cardinal landed on the edge of the railing, looked at me, then flew away. Its red body was too vivid against the gray and white. It felt like an intrusion, like something from another season that had slipped into the wrong page of the calendar. Inside again, I poured myself another cup of coffee. I added a splash of cream this time, not because I wanted to, but because it was habit. I drank it while standing by the window, watching the shadows shift across the fence line. Afternoon passed like a slow leak. I didn't check the clock anymore. The house grew quieter, as if it were listening to my thoughts and finding nothing worth echoing. By evening, I lit a candle, not out of festivity, but to push back the dimness. It smelled faintly of vanilla, though the scent was old, like something remembered rather than experienced. I placed the candle on the table and watched its flame tremble every time I moved. No music, no lights, no tree, no voices, only the steady sound of my own breathing and the tick of the clock. And somehow, that was enough to mark the day. Not celebrate it, just mark it, like a pencil line on the edge of a door frame that no one checks anymore. I had nearly forgotten it existed. The red metal toolbox sat at the back of the closet in the laundry room, underneath a stack of frayed beach towels and a broken oscillating fan that hadn't worked since the Clinton administration. Its handle was rusted, and the latch clicked with a tired, reluctant snap when I opened it. Inside, the tools were arranged almost exactly as I had left them, carefully, deliberately, the way I used to organize everything when my hands were still strong and the weekends still held meaning. The smell hit me first, that mix of oil, old steel, and the faint bite of cedar from a block I'd thrown in there years ago to fight the damp. It reminded me of the garage we used to have back in New Jersey, the way the concrete floor stayed cool even in summer, and the workbench was always cluttered with half-finished things. I used to keep a radio tuned to AM talk shows, the kind with hosts who sounded like they were speaking from a bar stool. I could listen for hours while sanding down chair legs or tightening door hinges. Now, the hammer had a faint line of rust along its head. The screwdriver handles were nicked and dull. The wrench I'd inherited from my father still bore his initials etched into the grip, JWH, barely visible beneath the grime. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand, letting the cold metal rest against my palm. I carried the toolbox to the kitchen table and set it down, gently, like an offering. The light from the window caught the scratches on the lid, turning them silver for a moment before the sun moved again. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the sky remained the color of wet cardboard. The wind had calmed. It was quiet. The toolbox wasn't just metal and bolts and dust. It was the last piece of something I had nearly let go of. All the other parts of my life, the house, the photos, the armchair by the window, had turned into set pieces in a story no one was reading. But this box, this heavy, dented, loyal thing, still contained the shape of my hands. I laid out each tool on a folded towel, cleaning them with a rag and a bit of oil I found under the sink. I worked slowly, carefully, the way I used to polish my shoes before job interviews or funerals. The smell of the oil mingled with the scent of stale bread from the kitchen counter and the faint citrus of the soap I used on the plates that morning. Each turn of the rag, each motion of my hand, brought back fragments. Not memories exactly, more like echoes. The time I fixed the banister after my son tripped over it during a sleepover. The morning I rewired the porch light so my wife wouldn't have to fumble in the dark. The day I built the sandbox in the backyard, and how the wood gave me splinters I didn't notice until much later. None of these stories had been written down. They lived only in the scratches on the pliers, the bent nail tucked into the corner of the box, the strip of masking tape wrapped around a handle where the rubber had split. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just worked. The radio in the corner was silent. The clock on the wall ticked, out of sync with the old watch I still kept in my dresser drawer, though its battery had long since died. I could feel the ache in my shoulders and the stiffness in my knees, but I didn't stop. Not because there was something to fix, but because there was something to feel. When I finished, I placed the tools back inside the box one by one, each in its place, like they were returning home. I closed the lid and sat there with my hand resting on top of it, the cold of the metal slowly warming under my skin. The house was still, the kind of stillness that comes after something ends, but before something begins. I looked out the window. The snow was starting to melt in thin, uneven patches. I could see the sidewalk again, and a lone tire track carving a path down the street. I thought of all the things I'd repaired in my life. Furniture, appliances, doors that wouldn't close right, shelves that tilted, toys with wheels that stuck, light switches that sparked, fences that leaned in the wind, hearts, maybe, once or twice in the quiet way a father does, by showing up or staying silent. But the hardest thing to repair had always been myself. The toolbox wouldn't fix that. No wrench could loosen regret. No hammer could knock bitterness into something useful. But cleaning the tools, touching them again, felt like I was remembering the man who used to believe he could fix anything. And for a moment, that was enough. I slid the toolbox back under the table, not back in the closet, not hidden, just there, where I could see it. It didn't mean anything had changed, but it meant I hadn't forgotten how.